Galas are terrible to plan. Anyone who says otherwise is likely in their post-event glow. But plan them we must, because for new donors, galas are low-risk ways to get to know your mission. A well-done event is a really effective reputation builder. They're also a great moment of pride and community for existing donors. So we dread galas and the 6 months of planning they bring, but we do them anyway. That's where RSVPify can help. RSVPify has been partnering with nonprofit organizations for the last decade, helping them create seamless event registration, ticket and table selling, and check-in experiences. Plan your gala, instill donor confidence, and raise more funds for your mission with RSVPify. Get started for free at rsvpify.org. That's rsvpify.org. And use the promo code NonprofitNation50 for 50% off any upgrade. RSVPify, your mission, our software. Hello, and welcome to Nonprofit Nation. I'm your host, Julia Campbell, and I'm going to sit down with nonprofit industry experts, fundraisers, marketers, and everyone in between to get real and discuss what it takes to build that movement that you've been dreaming of. I created the Nonprofit Nation podcast to share practical wisdom and strategies to help you confidently find your voice, definitively grow your audience, and effectively build your movement. If you're a nonprofit newbie or an experienced professional who's looking to get more visibility, reach more people, and create even more impact, then you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello. This is Nonprofit Nation. I'm your host, Julia Campbell. Today's topic, we're going to discuss tips for fundraising during an election year. So as many of you know, the U.S. gears up for the 2024 presidential election. And as nonprofit professionals, we might find ourselves at the intersection of philanthropy and politics. And there are so many unique challenges and opportunities that come with fundraising during an election year. Luckily, I have an expert. My guest this week is Alyssa Wright, industry expert on fundraising. Having spent time as a human rights activist in Eastern Europe and Africa, Alyssa brings over a decade of experience in international philanthropy to Wright Collective. With a background in community organizing and the arts, Alyssa leads the collective with skill, creativity, and passion. And in this episode, we're going to delve into some of the complexities of setting fundraising goals this year, drawing reflections from historical trends, research, and insightful analysis. So, Alyssa, welcome to the podcast.
So good to be here, Julia. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I should say welcome back. You have been on the podcast before talking all things millennial engagement and millennial donors. So I encourage people to go into the archives and check out that episode. But this time I invited you on because I was very interested in a blog post that you wrote called Elevate Your Fundraising Strategy, Practical Tips for Election Year Challenges. And really, what prompted you to take on this issue?
Yeah, so I've fundraised through 4 now federal election seasons. Find every year it very fascinating, sort of what we see in the landscape and how people respond to the outcomes, what the conversations are that people have. Mm-hmm. And I also think just as a grassroots community organizer and an artist at my core, as you shared in my bio, it's so important for me that people find creative ways to break through and have meaningful, truth-telling conversations when certain issues and topics are on the table. So it's not the time for folks to kind of, back away from having the difficult conversations. If it's, everywhere you turn on every app on your phone, maybe you should be engaging in it instead of running away from it. And so being a united front as an organization with what you're saying and what you're doing and how that translates to resources being mobilized for you, super important during an election year. So I think I wrote that blog because I was a little fired up to say, hey, we've been through a few tumultuous federal election seasons recently. And I think it's just so important for people to be prepared and ready and honest about what they can do around fundraising and communications.
Absolutely. And why is fundraising in an election year different?
Well, you probably
there's
know
a
from
lot of
some
reasons, probably.
Yeah, right. The 12-hour podcast on just that.
Yeah.
I think it's the heightened emotions, right? So it's like everyone's emotions are heightened because in some way you feel like there's an issue on the table that's going to impact you personally or your family or your community. And there's a lot of always discussions that are happening around it. I think that, again, that impacts where people move their money. How money moves has so much to do with our emotional response to things. And when there's heightened emotions during an election year, we tend to see a lot of that, and we have to be prepared for what we're going to say, because we also don't want to just be opportunistic as nonprofits, right? We want to be really clear and authentic in what we're saying. I think the other piece of it is that, it's just so crowded and noisy, right? So during an election year, like, you have to be ready because there's a lot of noise in what people are talking about, with all the parties and all the candidates involved. And so you have to think about, how do you break through the noise? And in terms of fundraising as well, a lot of the organizations that we work with at Wright Collective, at the agency, the fundraising agency that I run, so many of them are on the line every election season for federal dollars and grants that they get to take care of their people. So you actually might be either losing or potentially gaining funding based on the outcomes. So that's another reason to keep talking about it and to be aware.
Mm-hmm. How should nonprofits adjust their goals in response to everything that's going on with the political climate?
So I think the first thing that I'll say is, I think it's really important, if you look at any of the data on actual giving, charitable giving overall doesn't really fluctuate. Like, the same amount of money moves, where it moves is different. So people tend to give more politically. They tend to give to advocacy. They tend to give to specific issues or geographies. So how people give and where they give changes, but the amount actually doesn't, there's not a lot of variance in that. So that being said, I think you can have similar goals, but I also will say that I think the biggest and most important thing is to stay the heck away from November. So I try not to laugh when, and
that's a bummer, because it's Giving Tuesday, and there's a lot of different events going on in November.
110%. So like, that's, I think, one of the things that, organizations will say, I can't believe our year-end appeal underperformed. And I'm like, well, you dropped it on Halloween time and, Halloween time frame. And not surprising, because people were either distracted or giving in new and different ways based on the outcome of the elections. And then you slide into the holiday season and, it's busy for folks as well. So I tell everyone, really get clear on your goals, especially donors and events. Talk to people ahead of time. Like, again, you should be securing corporate sponsors a year out anyway. If you haven't secured them for your event by now and they're the bulk of your revenue in the fall, you should do it now. And then also major gifts. I've had most of my conversations with donors before April to say, hey, is your gift going to be the same or different this year based on it being an election year? And many of them were like, oh my gosh, that doesn't impact me at all. I'm going to keep giving the same exact way. I love you. I've been giving to you all for years now. Others said, actually, we are giving to some of the, making some political donations. So we might not do a sponsorship through the company and a personal family gift this year, just a heads up. So if you're not knowing and mapping that and kind of figuring out what the probability is of you getting funding across those departments and programs, that could affect your goals a lot too. You got to plan.
Absolutely. Should nonprofits be using this sort of heightened political climate to their advantage? And can you maybe explain how we can do that, or some of what are the risks and the benefits of doing that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I say, first and foremost, be a united front as an organization. You don't want a staff member, a community member, a board member being surprised by what the executive director or program director or board chair decides to say and do during a year like this. So that's really important. Like, you don't want to be in a position where you're saying or doing something or having a community conversation or a societal conversation that is going to surprise someone. So the first thing I'll just say is, be united as an organization, what you're saying, have your FAQs, talking points, that type of thing. The other thing I'll say is, I think, again, 110%. If you're an organization, I'll give an example. Like, we work with an organization that's supporting refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. And if immigrant rights are on the table and immigration's on the table and it's being discussed, why would you not share what your stance is and what your
I think it's irresponsible not to.
right? It's irresponsible if you don't. And donors will come to you asking that. And also, if a donor is supporting refugees and they see you're the only one of 2 organizations out of 20 they give to that didn't say anything during an election year, I mean, to me, that's a red flag as a philanthropist, because I would be like, I can't believe they didn't chime in on what potential harm or what potential support, whatever the, again, conversation is, could be a dynamic in their work. So I think you have to just be prepared. You have to know what you're going to say. And I would take advantage of it by starting community conversations, curating them in a way that's meaningful. And that almost always results in resource flow. When you have a really good community conversation, you ask for what you need to be prepared for any election outcome.
Talk to me more about community conversations and how organizations that have not done anything like that before, where do they start?
I think if you've never done it before, you can start with the basics. So again, to use the kind of example of working with the immigrant community, a lot of people don't even know the process for coming to the U.S. and what the landscape looks like. So sometimes starting with just a really simple overview of what the landscape is, what our organization does, walking people through really practical steps of what you do and how you do it. A lot of individuals that probably even give monthly to your work don't use the right language or don't understand the full process. So I think that the very basics, like back to basics, it's a great year to do that. Again, it's noisy. People might not even know what an asylum seeker is, but they're too embarrassed to ask because they've been donating to you for years, right?
Good point.
So community conversations can start with the basics. And then I think the other piece of it, as you want to get more creative and think about different ways to have those dialogues in community, talk about the role that funding plays. So again, we at Wright Collective, we do a lot of development audits and communications audits, and we check in on sort of what your constituents know. And one of the things I always find most fascinating is no one knows how you're funded and where your funding flows. So often we have people who come to us and say, hey, we thought that organization was super duper well resourced because they get federal funding. Well, they only get federal funding and it costs $1 million to run their organization and they get a $550,000 grant. How did you think the deficit was made up? Or people have the thought of, oh my gosh, I thought all their funding went to, this particular issue or program. Well, no, actually, because this other part of the program has to happen first before people can even get their green cards, et cetera. So people have a lot of misconceptions. It's a good year to be simple, basic, to the point, and then try to translate those community conversations around those things to why you need resource flow.
I absolutely love that and completely agree. Getting back to basics. I believe that we are overthinking our fundraising sometimes and our communication efforts with our donors and not understanding that they are passionate about an issue. They don't know the nuts and bolts of everything that you do, and they don't understand the facets. And like you said, potentially they are embarrassed to ask because it's something they feel like they should know. I feel like I should be, as a fairly well-informed person, I should know the ins and outs of all of the issues that I support, but I often leave it to the nonprofits that I support to inform me and to tell me. Yeah. And there's so many myths and misconceptions about the work that a lot of us do and the clients we serve and the missions that we work on. Speaking of, immigration or climate change, I mean, you just name anything, literacy, food insecurity, whatever it might be. There's so many myths and misconceptions and stereotypes out there that we can address. And I think we have a responsibility to address.
I agree. And that's where, again, if you're worried about what you should or shouldn't say, organizations will often say to me, what can I say?
Organizations always say to me, I can't even get involved at all because we are a 501c3. So
not true.
Address that. Let's break that myth.
Yeah. I mean, that's so not true. I mean, you can talk about any issue and your stance on the issue. You just can't support political candidates or give politically, right, as a nonprofit. So it's fascinating to me because I do often find organizations when, they say different things. As someone who works at every level, Julia, of the organization, I have the one-on-ones with the donors. I speak in events in front of an audience. I write materials that go out in, listservs. I find it fascinating that we're often afraid to broadly disseminate what we say in one-on-one conversations. And so I want to honor that, like, every organization, every person, you're sort of on a different trajectory with what you say. But my first $1 million gift I ever closed for an organization, I said things in that one-on-one at that person's kitchen counter, that, I was like, why don't we put this on our social? Like, this is actually the real. And once that donor sort of understood what the real dynamics were and the barriers being faced, she said, I'm going to try to do a 3-year $1 million grant. I'll get back to you soon. So I think that's where, again, like, just challenging some of the norms of being afraid of what we broadly disseminate, but we say in, quiet spaces. Get it out there this year and be unapologetic.
How can we get over our fear of offending people?
Ooh, what's that quote they say? I'm going to say this wrong, but like, every good leader has enemies or something, or
I forget. I love that.
Right. There's some quote out there.
If you don't have enemies, you're probably not a leader. I mean, maybe not enemies per se, like you don't necessarily need a nemesis. But this is what I say to my clients, if you're sending out an email, not every email, but if you're sending out an email that's about an issue and you don't get pushback, you're not taking it far enough.
Right. Yeah. I don't know the exact quote, but something along those lines of,
I love it.
Of that. Yeah. I think is really important. We'll have to find that exact quote somewhere. But yeah, I mean, I remember our collective sending out our statement on George Floyd and racial equity and the unsubscribes that I got from that during 2020.
Good. I say goodbye.
Right. And I just remember sort of having this, like, clearing the spreadsheet to add to the spreadsheet kind of attitude of, like, goodbye to the 20 people that, didn't believe or didn't have a values alignment with our work, and hello to the 20 new people that I'm going to embrace and meet. And so that's where I think in fundraising, it's really important for organizations to trust and believe in abundance, because for me, that's so core to the work that I do in fund development. I have said no to many donors. I think maybe we talked on the last podcast episode of some sexual harassment I experienced as a young fundraiser. And I had to say no to a 6-figure donor because of that instance. I'm like, I'm not meeting with this guy anymore. I'm done. And, the organization was like, oh my gosh, like, he gives 6 figures every year. This is going to hurt our budget, or we have a small budget, blah, blah. And I said, if you're going to have someone who is abusing people and is still keeping them as a donor, I had to say no. And so I think it's very similar, not to go to that extreme in every situation, but if people don't align and they disappear from sending in the check or being the monthly donor, I think that's okay, because it means that someone who's more aligned with your work, who is going to treat you well, who is going to invest in the well-being of your organization and hold it with love and intention, they're going to show up. And if you don't core fundamentally as a fundraiser believe that, it's really tough to be a fundraiser, and you'll probably have a lot of burnout because you'll hold on to really toxic, unhealthy relationships because they come with a check. So this year, just be mindful of that. I can't tell you how many donors during the last federal election season, Julia, they found new donors, and big new donors, and consistent new donors, and passionate fundraiser volunteer donors, because of the things they said and did, even though other relationships fell away.
How is donor behavior changing, or how do like political ideologies influence donor behavior?
Oh my gosh, that's a whole separate podcast.
Or how does donor behavior change in an election season? You talked a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But you find that they become more passionate. And then of course some people want nothing to do with speaking on issues. But do you find that your real donors, you can build a deeper relationship with them, like it's an opportunity?
So I'll say that I'll just share anecdotally from my own fundraising experience, probably last November until now. So 6 months of fundraising or so. A lot of donors don't even want to have that conversation, and that's fine. Right. So you open the door to the conversation. You say, are you open to, hearing about this? Or can I tell you 3 ways the federal election might affect the population we serve? Depends. Are they open to that conversation or not? I've had donors write me back and say, I don't like to be political, but we'll still keep giving to your food bank. Right. And I'm like, well, food insecurity is a little political, but anyway. So I've had folks reach out and say, just not in that place. That's fine. I tag it in the database and don't go back and say the same thing again. And I I trust that they'll receive our broader communications and understand our feelings and the potential impact that politics do have on the nonprofit sector. And then the second piece, I think, is, when you do open the door, right, it's an invitation to that conversation and someone wants to have that with you. I do find that a lot of people are curious how their political giving, their advocacy, they're curious to learn more about where else they can create resource flow for change. I've experienced that a lot in the birth justice ecosystem, donors recognizing that we have to pass certain legislature to be able to actually have the type of care that birth centers require allowed for midwives to practice, for doulas to practice, et cetera. It's not just about philanthropy and, putting brick by brick up and then having maternal health care available for community. So when they see the duality and the importance of their resources in that kind of way, I think they are grateful. And so if you have a donor that, is already passionate and wants to learn more and is trusting of your work, I think that you might get some questions this year of how they can be more politically aligned with your mission and accelerate change for you.
What about our overall communication strategy, like advertising? Should we continue to be pushing our message out there in as many ways as we are? I know social media advertising, especially during election season or any kind of advertising, is going to be filled with political ads. There's going to be robocalls. There's going to be flyers, mailings. We're going to be kind of inundated with these messages. So how should our marketing communication strategy change?
I think it's actually a great year to test out some of your messages and see what a broader audience responds to. I actually looked up some research earlier this year when I was thinking about this topic, and I read in March, I think it was a group called Sprout Social. Social media. They did like a listening audit of the number of impressions and engagements from January 1st to March 15th, I believe, of this year, 2024.
I'll link to it in the show notes. Sprout Social.
It was really good. I think it was March 15th of this year. And in those 2.5, 3 months that they audited, there were 4.5 million engagements and 103 billion impressions surrounding federal election messaging. I don't know the exact, formula for what they looked at, but if there's 103 billion impressions around something that says it's an election year or federal election or whatever it might be, maybe, again, those are some of the messages with advertising you test out. So could you say, again, not to go back to something I shared earlier, but I think the 3 ways the federal election could affect refugees and those who love them in the state of Maine, right? Click here, and running ads like that kind of get people back to your website, learning about what you do. I think that things like that are really great to test out and try, or to highlight, highlight particular pieces of legislation in the past that have helped and say elections make a difference, and, voting and philanthropy go together, or whatever kind of some of those one-liners are that you want to say. But I think it's a great opportunity to test things out. And I also think it's a great year to, again, cutting through the noise. And I don't know, Julia, what your thoughts would be on this too, but choosing maybe just 1 or 2 social media platforms where you're really getting engagement, more political engagement, and zeroing in. So for instance, Facebook for a lot of our clients in New England is the big one. And so they'll zero in on just Facebook and Instagram, I think, with some of their digital ads that they actually pay for, because that's where people are getting their political news. They'll post in mom groups or entrepreneurship groups or leaders of color kind of groups, to talk about the work that they're doing, because that's where they feel specifically some people are interested in the conversation.
I completely agree with that. And I just get really upset when I see all of these issues not contextualized by a nonprofit. So, the famous case, the case in front of the Supreme Court right now, the city of Grants Pass v. Johnson, the Oregon City, it has implications that are so far reaching. The Supreme Court could be criminalizing sleeping outdoors by individuals with no other place to go. So I feel like there should be a lot of talking about this. Oh, and he's woke up.
We got to 32.
I wake him up because I was yelling.
Hold on. Go ahead. We're good.
Okay. The thing is that I don't know if you saw my email and I wrote a blog post about it, but I was shocked at the silence around this case because I really feel like we need to be contextualizing this. Like, this is not just a case in Oregon. Like, this has implications in California. It has implications across the country. So why aren't we talking more about this case and what's going on? And like you said, the 3 ways that this case could affect the homeless population in Boston or something like that. I do think there are ways that we can step into the fray and be that united front and really make a stand around issues that are important, because I think that's what we should be doing. Like, we all want to put our heads down and pretend that the outside world doesn't affect our work, but in reality, it has huge, far-reaching consequences for us.
Yeah, I mean, even think about, it's Pride Month, and I saw an organization that just put out a statement that no matter what direction I think they said any election ever goes, they're not even an LGBTQA supporting or specific organization. That's not their issue. I think they're actually an animal rescue, but they put something on and said, we will never not support our staff and our volunteers who are part of this community. And so it's things like that too, where it's just like, you remember those things, and again, did they lose a couple of people who are anti-supporting that community? Maybe on their listserv when they sent that out. But I'm sure they gained a lot of followers too, who are like, wow, they really care about supporting their team, even though it's not their issue that they're specifically working on, because they're just rescuing really cute puppies, right?
Exactly. I just was on a Pride float in Boston with the Trustees of the Reservation, which is an organization here, a nonprofit, and they protect land and they protect animals, and they do a lot of educational, there's a lot of educational components and children's camps and things like that. They have farms, they have beaches, they have coastline, they have all marshes, all sorts of things, hiking trails. And you should have seen people's faces light up when our float went by, because they said, oh my gosh, I know the Trustees. I know Crane's Beach. I know this hiking trail. I know this particular park. And they see me, they see me. And then, of course, there are people that would oppose that. Right. But it's a value of the Trustees. That is one of their stated core values. And they really wanted to make a statement. And I completely agree with you. For the 5 people that got upset and maybe unsubscribed from their newsletter when they saw that, they claimed an entirely new and passionate and energized community by doing that.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I think the other thing, just with it, again, thinking about some of the issues that are on the table with this election season, I also think that fundamentally, our democracy is
at stake.
Right. And so if you believe in any type of democratic practice, I think that there are also statements around that are really important for you to share and to acknowledge. I just read something that a giving circle, a women's giving circle, which I think you and I both know is like the democratic practice of pooling funds, and you vote and you give. They just talked about how important it was for them in democratizing philanthropy to protect the democracy right now. And so it almost transcends any issue. Every nonprofit in some way, I think, is threatened in this climate, because we do need that landscape to function in and serve our communities. So, I think that it's a really important time. If I said there's one thing you do in the next 30 days, it's a really important time to sit down and say, what are we saying this year? How are we saying it? And how are we also disseminating that? Right. So, some organizations that might be a little bit more timid about it might say, okay, we'll send out a couple of e-blasts and see how those newsletters do or whatnot. Other organizations might say, let's have a whole strategy around it. Let's do 3 pop-up community events with conversations linked to it and run a whole social media campaign. So you'll find on the continuum from, sort of warming up to this idea of being, quote, more politically engaged, to all the way being sort of like, it's part of our culture and DNA. We do it all the time, what you want to do this year, but don't miss the opportunity, because, people are listening. And I think that especially, for fundraising, when people listen and they feel moved, it's still emotional in many ways for them to give. I became a monthly donor to 3 different organizations when the year Trump was first elected, and I still am with them, right? So I think that people will get engaged at certain points and stay with you if they continue to see the impact of your work.
Exactly. And the same with me. And I know that rage giving was very popular, or it still is pretty popular. And it's that emotional connection that you feel. It doesn't have to be inspiring. It can be that you're angry and you want to make a difference on something that you feel so passionately about. So if we get down to sort of nuts and bolts, what are you recommending for your clients generally? When should we be sending out our appeals? Should we be waiting until December, or how should we? I know you said for your major donors, like having conversations with them, but what about for like a bigger mass appeal?
Yeah. So I would say any big chunks of money, your major gifts program, your gala, your corporate sponsorship strategy, any really big parts of your budget that you fundraise for, I would say by the end of this month, ideally, before they go into summer and then school starting and Labor Day, all that, I would say by the end of this month, you're really just saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, like, are you still planning on making your commitment this year? Because if it's like a $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 plus gift, you really just want to make sure those are secured and they're not on the table. Because I did get surprised with some client projects a couple of years ago in the last election season by folks who didn't make their big year-end gifts. And January 15th of the following year, we were still sort of like, hey, are you going to give for last year? So don't be surprised by any of those big buckets. What I would say for a year-end appeal or any campaigns you traditionally run, you mentioned Giving Tuesday, Julia. I wouldn't set a super aggressive, large goal unless you've had a major change in your organization. So if all of a sudden, early this year you went viral and you have 10,000 new people on your listserv, okay, yeah, maybe you want to set a higher benchmark because you're going to target them with a Giving Tuesday campaign. But for a year-end appeal that, there haven't been any dramatic or dynamic changes, I would say dropping that earlier is better and really important. And then I would just make sure that you have some really creative ways to break through the noise after the election happens. So if you send it out in late September, early October, and you feel like you've got 75% of it secured by mid-November, if that other 25% does or doesn't not come in, doesn't make a big impact on your budget, that's probably good. But don't bank on a third of our budget comes from the year-end appeal every year, and we're going to drop it in October and think that the same checks and donations online and whatnot are going to come in. I think that can put you in a really tough position if you don't have that happen. And then same thing with events. I would say make sure, a lot of clients who have galas in the fall moved them up by a week or two just to get further away from the election. So they were like, we just don't even want to be near it because we don't know how we're going to be feeling and what's going to be happening. As we know, there's also the threat of physical violence and financial instability in our country around that. So, just being really mindful, people might not buy a ticket and come out to a gala in November. Or even in late October, right? So the bulk of our clients, we've recommended they have their events where they get a significant amount of funding. They do a lot of investment in advertising, community awareness building in September this year, and just kind of stay away from the latter part of the year.
I've been recommending really having that empathy for your donors and understanding that things are very fraught and people are very anxious and very uncertain. Right, especially as we get closer to the election date. So I completely appreciate moving things up, trying to do things a little bit earlier. The real problem is a lot of nonprofits do make a lot of their money, or they generate a lot of their revenue at year end. So this kind of pivot is something I think we have to think strategically about and really plan well ahead for, and just be cognizant that our donors and our corporate sponsors and they're not going to necessarily be in the best headspace depending on what happens.
And I think that call me old fashioned, millennial me over here, but I still believe in the phone call, personalized email, door knocking strategy, because that's where I came from, in terms of fundraising. So if you, again, I'm not saying don't fundraise towards the end of the year. You still need to be sending out your messages and connecting with people, but you might get to the last week of November, first week of December, and you're a board member that gets a list of 30 names and you got to make some phone calls and say, can we count on your gift this year?
Yes.
Still, or you might need to walk around town and knock on the doors of the people who always give to the food bank and just say, hey, just wanted to remind you, like, we still have folks in our community that need your support this holiday season. Here's a postcard. So don't be afraid of that grassrootsy fundraisingness. It's something I personally enjoy as an extrovert. Like, I like being out connecting with people. But you might need to do a little bit more of that towards year end if people aren't responding sort of the general mailing or the general digital outreach that you do.
Such a great point. So tell us about Wright Collective and how people can work with you.
Yeah. So Wright Collective is 8 years old this year, which I really can't believe.
Happy birthday.
Feels really good. Yeah, thank you. And we are a women-owned, women-led, women-run agency. We are focused on fund development and philanthropic advising. So we're all about mobilizing resources. We work both with nonprofits, social enterprises, helping them fundraise and collect resources as much as we do with donors, family funds, corporate philanthropies, giving circles to help them disseminate and move and give away money. We specialize in capital campaigns and what we call growth campaigns. We are rooted in an abundance mindset, and our core curriculum is all about abundance that we facilitate for nonprofits. And it's really from my belief of years and years of fundraising and, sort of disregarding all the fancy collateral and beautiful spreadsheets and donor data that we had to just sit down and have meaningful conversations and say, how much can we give to these movements? And then seeing what was possible. So we are very human-centered in what we do, community-centered in what we do. And actually, as of last December, in our 8 years of existence, we moved a little over $100 million to social change organizations with both donors through their philanthropies and also with nonprofits through the campaigns that we run. And we're really proud of that. So yeah, get in touch with us. We're looking for partnerships going into 2025, so you can never plan too early. And just really grateful, Julia, to be here and be in this space with you. And thanks for the work that you do too. Let's have some really profound, difficult, wonky, great conversations this year.
That's what I want. That's what I'm aiming and aspiring to lead. So you can find Alyssa's information and information about the Wright Collaborative, if you're listening, in the show notes. And just thanks so much, Alyssa. I know you're busy working mom and new mom of 3. So I really appreciate you taking the time, especially on your maternity leave, to be here and record this with us today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me again.
Well, hey there. I wanted to say thank you for tuning into my show and for listening all the way to the end. If you really enjoyed today's conversation, make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app, and you'll get new episodes downloaded as soon as they come out. I would love if you left me a rating or a review, because this tells other people that my podcast is worth listening to. And then me and my guests can reach even more earbuds and create even more impact. So that's pretty much it. I'll be back soon with a brand new episode. But until then, you can find me on Instagram at JuliaCampbell77. Keep changing the world, you nonprofit unicorn.